I was a 911 operator in Mobile, Alabama the day Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast. We started getting lots of calls from New Orleans and the Mississippi Gulf Coast for some reason. I guess they started routing to us after all the 911 centers to the west of us started going down. Anyways, I got a call from a woman who said she was trapped in her house on Gordon Street between Florida and Law. I was confused at first because we have a Florida street in Mobile, and after checking and double checking and not being able to find her address, I asked her what city she was calling from and she said, "I'm in New Orleans." I tried to route her to New Orleans 911 and New Orleans Fire Department but could not get through. She started screaming and said the water was coming up into the attic where she was. I told her to find something heavy and break the attic vent out so she could get onto her roof, but the vent was too small for her to crawl through. She sat down and started crying. I told her I would stay on the line with her for as long as she wanted me to. I stayed on the line and listened as she cried, prayed, cussed, and prayed some more. A little while later I could hear her struggling to keep her head and phone above water, then the phone went dead. To this day I do not know if she lived or died. I quit 911 3 months after Katrina. Story 2. My mom was a 911 dispatcher in the early 90s. I was 5 years old, in Washington State. When I got older, I remember asking her about some of the calls that she could still recall. One, in particular, was pretty bad. She was working one year on Halloween night, and around 10 or 11 p.m. she had a call come in that a couple of guys were driving around town with a dummy or something dragging behind their truck. The dummy was falling apart and pieces of clothing and plastic were being torn off and scattered around the city. Being Halloween, it seemed like a prank, but she had a patrol car trying to find and stop the truck. As time goes by, more and more people started to call about it. Eventually, the patrol car caught up with the truck, and it turns out that it was a person. The guys had gone to a store earlier, and when they left, they had backed their truck into an elderly man whose clothes got caught in the rear bumper or whatnot. The two guys never even knew that they were dragging around another human being across town for miles. The elderly man had passed away, and those pieces of clothing scattered around town were his clothing, flesh, and body parts. Still gives me chills. Story 3. A call comes in the dead of night, and a middle-aged fellow is reporting a burglary in progress in a lower-income part of town. He's locked himself in the bathroom and communicating in short, terrified whispers. He describes the sound of feet shuffling around the house and getting nearer to him. He hears a couple of male voices talking about which items to take and if anyone is here. He stops answering me periodically as he hears footsteps coming closer. He describes seeing the shadows of 2 pairs of feet walking by the door into his bedroom. He's pleading with me to hurry up and send the police because he doesn't have any weapons and he's disabled, and what if they hurt him? He's quietly sobbing as he tells me that they're right outside the bathroom door now, just standing there, and they know he's in there. I heard a small knock in the background. Police arrive at that moment and clear the scene. I tell him to come to the door, it's safe now. He does so and disconnects the line. Heard later from the officers that when the guy opened the door, the entire house was covered wall to wall in aluminum foil and webs of fishing lines and other booby traps so thickly spread throughout the house that it was impossible for any creature, human or otherwise, to have entered or sneaked around the residence, much less the homeowner himself. He had been sitting by the front door the entire time. Story 4. I was a criminal justice major in college, and as one of my summer jobs/internships, I was a non-emergency dispatcher at a 911 center. I was surprised about the number of emergency calls I got on the non-emergency lines. A couple of examples: an old guy mad at the minority kids playing in the street in front of his house threatened to go outside with his shotgun and confront their mom because the police were taking too long to come to answer his complaint. A lady called saying she found a guy passed out in her driveway and wanted to know if she should ignore it or if we should send an ambulance. We sent an ambulance. The one that sticks with me though is an elderly lady calling saying that her grandson and husband were burning trash in the backyard and something exploded and her husband was on fire. Her grandson was 8 to 9 years old and could not do anything about it. When the fire department got there, they said his skin was like melted plastic, and as soon as they tried to get him on the backboard, it came off, exposing all his organs, etc. He died en route to the hospital. My grandson watched everything. Story 5. I answered a call from a guy who was screaming about how a relative of his that he found outside was bleeding from the head and was laying on the ground. It was a call that was way out there in the boondocks, so I was going to be on the line with this guy for a while. It wasn't helping that he was freaking out and yelling at me nearly the entire time. While I was going through questions with him about the patient's condition, he was yelling, "He's bleeding from the head. Send help." We already had an ambulance and police and fire on the way. Suddenly, during the assessment, he yells, "He's not breathing." At that point, I do my best to calm him down and guide him through CPR instructions. He did a very good job, and the patient started breathing again after about 300 compressions. Once that happened, I immediately went to the controlled bleeding protocol and asked him to get a dry, clean towel or cloth and apply it to the wound on his head. The guy would not do it. At this point, he was an emotional wreck and didn't want to leave him no matter how much I tried to talk to and reason with him. I was practically begging the guy to go get something to control the bleeding. He kept saying over and over that he didn't want to leave him. After a while, the police showed up on the scene first. I asked him if they were there, and he said yes. Just before I was about to hang up and let them talk to him, I heard a police officer say, "Sir, I need you to step away from that guy on the ground." That call gave me chills. Story 6. I once took a call from a kidnapping victim who jumped out of a moving car in an office park. She had no idea where she was, and I couldn't get a valid location on her cell phone. This was in 2004, only the nearest cell tower. Usually, I would ask a caller in her situation to start looking in mailboxes for mail with an address on the envelope. But this was an office park with mail slots that she couldn't access. She was running for her life while I was on the phone with her, hiding behind dumpsters and bushes while the kidnappers patrolled the office park. The terror in her voice was gut-wrenching. She had already been beaten, and she was afraid that if they found her, they would kill her. After about 5 minutes of this terrifying call, she was finally able to find a business sign on one of the windows in the complex. I frantically searched for the business address, and the radio dispatcher aired the location, to which at least a dozen officers responded. They found the suspect vehicle pretty quickly, and a short-foot chase ensued. The K-9 officer ended that in no time. The first officer to reach the caller ordered a victim's advocate because of the condition she was in. I had to take a few minutes off after that call. Story 7. I was a 911 dispatcher in my very small hometown. On my first night on my own, without guidance from my supervisor, I had a call that there was a bad accident slightly out of my jurisdiction and that a group of young men was involved, including several of my childhood friends. I was recently graduated from high school. I knew there had been a fatality, but I didn't know who it was, and my speculations were quite scary as I waited to hear. My job was to contact the family of one of the boys in the accident and to tell them which hospital he was taken to. I knew the kid, and I had to tell his mom he was in a serious accident, but I couldn't identify myself. Then she called me back when she got to the hospital that they couldn't find her son. We went back and forth several times as I tried to figure out where the disconnect of information was. Eventually, I found out they couldn't find him because he was in the morgue. He was the one who died. I felt like an idiot for telling his mom to go to the hospital, but those were my instructions, and it was the best information I had at the time. I later made the mistake of talking to EMS who were on the scene for that wreck and asking for details. My friend had been entrapped while the driver was able to get out. Flames began to spread in the car, but they couldn't get my friend out. EMTs pulled on his arm, trying anything to get him out, but it was so hot his flesh just came off. And he died screaming, alive, and burning to death. Probably the worst way to go, and my colleagues had to stand there watching it all happen. Those images have burned themselves into my mind permanently. I went to my friend's funeral and couldn't say a word about what I knew about the accident. People say things like, he went peacefully, it was on impact. Well, that wasn't true at all, but but it was a nice sentiment to spread, and I would never correct it. I think I was probably the only person there who knew what happened, and that was both comforting and very difficult to manage. I was haunted for a while. I didn't do anything wrong, but someone I knew and cared about died horrifically, and I couldn't share those details with anyone who knew him. My family and friends pumped me for information, small town, and I shared as little as possible, which was the right thing to do in all ways, but it was still hard not to be able to talk about it. I did tell myself that I would never have a call worse than that, and in 6 years of dispatching, it was true. My first night was my worst. Story 8. I work as a 911 operator/dispatcher in Florida. Last week I took a call from a woman who sounded pretty scared, whispering into the phone, who said that somebody was breaking into her house. This isn't the first time this type of call has come in, but it's always been a friend or a relative coming over unannounced, or a mentally unstable caller thinking that a plant on a table wrapped behind a window curtain is a burglar. True story. As such, I was gathering information but was not yet convinced that it was a legit burglary. A minute into the call, the woman says she hears a gunshot in the background. I don't hear anything, but know on the screen that per the caller shots have been fired. Just then I hear something close enough to the phone that it sounds like it's coming from the next room over. Obvious gunshots. At this point, it hits me that, yeah, this is happening, and this was either a home invasion or somebody is defending their home with force. I quickly ended the call and passed the caller to the sheriff's office for their portion of the interrogation. Hours later, a hospital in a neighboring county called and asked if we were looking for any gunshot victims. They had a drive up without any good explanation for how it happened, and it happened to be one of our burglars. It had been a relative of my caller who came across the burglars in the house and opened fire on them, hitting one before they took off. Story 9. I am not a dispatcher, but I had to call 911, and the situation still horrifies me. I had just gotten off work and was at my apartment. I was 19 and my friend, Tyler, was 16. She came up to visit me, and we were hanging out with my roommate, the boyfriend's bestie, and his girlfriend. My roommate was drinking and wanted to show us a shotgun he had just bought. I am military police, so obviously this was a bad idea, and a felony since he was drinking. He got it out anyways and ended up shooting Tyler. Her leg was blown off. I called 911 with Tyler, my roommate, and his girlfriend all screaming their heads off. As I was calling 911, I was directing my roommate on first aid. When the paramedics got there, they told me if I had waited even just a minute longer on directing first aid, Tyler would have died from blood loss and shock. Afterward, I had to clean the apartment. The mess had not been cleaned by the authorities. There was a major investigation because of that, so I had to clean the blood and pick up the tissue, skin, and bone that was all over the living room. It was horrifying, but luckily for me, being military police helped me stay calm during the situation. It still haunts me today. I hear all the screaming and I remember the look on my roommate's face when he realized what he had done. The look of complete horror and guilt. None of us have been the same from it. Story 10. Do not work there anymore, but I worked nights and operator services for 10 months at BT. I was the British Telecom employee who asks which service you need and passes your details through to the local service. We were a 24-hour center that took calls from all over the UK, including Ireland. A few spring to mind, chiefly the one call I was 100% sure someone had died when a mother called having found her daughter dead in her bed surrounded by pills. The rules say you must remain on the line in cases of extreme distress or the case of very young or old callers, in case the caller is unable to articulate and the other operator needs help/details from our system, so I had to sit and listen to the fruitless efforts of a distraught woman desperately trying to resuscitate a body which had been cold and dead for probably 4 hours. Different but equally sad was the old woman who called wanting the police, saying she had been kidnapped and was being held in a strange place against her will. The number came back to a nursing home, and a nurse soon came on the line apologizing, saying she has dementia and keeps forgetting she had moved out of her house years ago. I still had to call the police on her behalf just in case though, since if the caller asks for the police, you are legally obligated to connect them or pass whatever details you have onto the police anyway. Finally, and possibly worst, an awful Christmas Eve where either there was some catastrophic technical fault or they badly messed up the staffing levels that year in that part of London, but calls were just going unanswered by the emergency services in part of the city. The longest I had someone on was 45 minutes to get through to the ambulance dispatch. The standard procedure was to cycle through 3 different numbers for that service and neighboring ones who could respond, and then inform the supervisor, who calls an escalation line to get the call answered. I shudder to think how many people suffered from lack of access to vital emergency aid that night. Story 11. Been working as a police call taker for 3 months. We take calls from multiple police jurisdictions. We cover a large area and a variety of communities. A couple of highlights from my short time here so far. The mother found her son's suicide note in his bedroom. We go through the standard questions: last known location, cell phone, description, method, mode of travel, previous history, etc. While I was waiting for members to arrive at her home, she told me about him and how he was supposed to go on a 7-day trip with the Coast Guard the next day. The phrase she said that sticks with me are "my heart is in my boots," not a popular saying where I'm from. Members arrive, and so I disconnect so she can speak with them. 1 minute later, I see an update in the file, already hung in the backyard: body is cold. He was right outside the window the whole time we were talking. A girl I graduated high school with went missing over the weekend while I was on my block. I took a call from someone that had seen her right after she went missing and gave a description and directions for travel. They don't find her. The next day we get a call of a body found hanging in the woods. It's her. Suicide. When I went on my lunch break, I made the mistake of looking at my Facebook wall and saw all the missing person posts and a heartbreaking interview with her dad describing how unusual her disappearance was. She was a sweet girl. I remember going to the fair/carnival with her and her friends when we were 14. As part of our training, we listened to some of the more intense calls. The worst one was one of a woman whose boyfriend shot her in the mouth. The call starts with a baby screaming and howling in the background and some gurgling and groaning from the woman. She's only half conscious and barely managed to dial. She was able to tell the call taker her boyfriend shot her and which way he went. She also kept repeating, "I'm going to die. I'm dying." The gurgling, sobbing, and constant howling is something I'll never forget. She survived somehow though, so that's good. A woman in the apartment sobbing uncontrollably, saying she can hear her neighbor screaming, "My baby is dead." The caller says she has 2- and 3-year-old kids. Once the police get there though, I see the update that the deceased was like 50 to 60 years old though. So not entirely sure what was going on there. We had like 4 to 5 callers for that one, so the file was a mess. Story 12. So, I've had plenty of heartbreaking calls, but the one that keeps me up is because it was so weird and disturbing rather than tragic. So set up, I work medical and we cover a fairly large geographic area. Calls come over with minimal info from the first call takers, so we know the location and that it's a medical issue. Okay, tell me exactly what happened. Standard first question. A young sounding woman replies pretty calmly but energetically. "My back hurts, and Uncle Ricky is real." She proceeded to explain that she had chronic back pain and that she'd been in the hospital the day before because of it. But they didn't refill her meds while she was there, and Uncle Ricky made her throw her old ones out. The more we talked, the more irrational and erratic her answers got. I ask her to make sure the door is unlocked and pets are put away, and she says the door is open. Then she tells me about her cat and that it's already outside. Don't tell Uncle Ricky about her cat. He made them kill the last cat she had. Her dad and her cousins. They killed all the cats. But they're locked up now. She named all her cats for me. There were a lot. She mentions that there's a Sasquatch outside. She can see its eyes in the woods. She kept this up for 20 minutes. Just before the ambulance arrives, she starts talking to someone who got there first. It's a patrol car that had been quietly sent.